sketchy, go, ichie. Hello everybody, welcome to a nightmare edition of Sketchy Go Ichie. Here we will take on our favorite villainous character, Freddy Krueger. And if you notice, I've already started by finding some nice photo reference of Freddy and sort of kind of taking 3 or 4 different images, probably just Google images, and sort of creating a nice little composition. The image size, I should mention, which I haven't in previous videos, is 11 by 17. It's done in the Procreate app using the Apple Pencil on the iPad Pro. And the brush I'm using, which everyone always asks, is the technical pen brush, which I have altered to make it a little more gnarly, a brush to make these effects that I'm going for. And really, this video is all about detailing and how to capture texture. In this case, obviously anyone who's aware of the Freddy Krueger character from the 1980s Nightmare on Elm Street series will realize that Freddy's got this really, as you can see here, really kind of disgustingly burnt face, and he exists in your nightmares. That's kind of his realm. And so in order to capture that really sort of irregular, burnt, gnarly facial thing that he's got going on here, it's really just a series of lines that taper. In order to create texture in line, a lot of it is on how you taper the line. If I was to attempt to render this character in just one single mono line, one single line weight, it wouldn't have the same sort of impact. I point to the area along his neck, right where his ear, that sort of burnt up ear is, and it kind of descends into the shadow of his hat, from his ear down his neck into where it meets the top of his tattered sweater. You notice there is not a straight, clean line. The tapering of the line, you ask anyone who inks for a living, or anyone who likes to ink or appreciates looking at renderings that are rendered in ink, what makes it so dynamic, the line so dynamic, as I kind of zoom in here, is the tapering of the line, is the inconsistency of the line. But notice, however, as I kind of render this sort of area that's just underneath the brim of his hat, again, all the lines, none of them are, they're consistent in that they all go in one direction, but what they are not consistent in is the same exact line weight, meaning from the point I set the pen down to where I pick it back up, it is not the same line weight. Meaning, to further drill into that, imagine if you were to start a line and it was completely the same thickness from point A to point B. So from the entry of the line to the exit, what you would have is a completely straight line. Well, hopefully, if that's what you're aiming for, or a completely, round circle, or whatever shape that you're trying to render. And that's great if you're doing something that is less organic. And even though Freddy appears to be this undead character, there is life in the organic quality of the line. And what I'm doing here is a technique called cross-hatching. Cross-hatching was utilized, probably for, out of God, as long as people have been laying, pen and brush down on surface using black ink or whatever color ink. And so it feels eternal. But cross-hatching, is the process of sort of creating grays out of using a black line. By creating grays, I mean by throwing these lines down, these etched lines, it creates a mid-tone that you wouldn't otherwise see with just stark white of the surface and black of the ink. That's cross-hatching. And so when you cross-hatch, you essentially draw lines in either vertical or horizontal or even a diagonal direction, and then you'll render lines in an opposite direction, sometimes that overlap those the previous lines. And what that creates is a sort of mid-tone. And there's also a technique called feathering, which you'll see a lot in this piece, is particularly in these detailed areas. And feathering is just that tapered line that I was clumsily trying to describe. All right, so I'll zoom out here so you can kind of see the overall shape. For every one of these projects, even if, again, I'm working from a series of photo references, but the important element is the composition. I want you guys to note how much white space, even though this is a long, narrow image, and even though I've cropped off the top of his hat, I want you to note the amount of white space that is behind his hat, the space between his face and that sort of like knife-fingered glove weapon that he has. The spaces in between the fingers going down towards the bottom center of the image. It's white space. It's what kind of makes it, makes the composition look more dynamic, for one, and be more legible. And let's face it, what you're going for is legibility in any kind of composed image. It's what allows the details to stand out. Now, as I zoom back in, it's probably a little more difficult to see legibility with the photograph, but when I pull it away, hopefully, I always say that, hopefully, you'll see, because I've A, tapered the line, B, included crosshatch, and C, spotted blacks, meaning I punched in areas of thicker outline and thicker sort of black shapes, shadows. For example, the area right beneath his nose as it descends down towards his teeth, the area just below his teeth, as you saw there. As you can see here, the area around his neck, that shadow that's just below his chin, and then the area there where his tattered collar of his sweater kind of heads back over his shoulder, And without those shapes, all the detail would be a mess. It would be just a collection of feathered lines and crosshatched lines, and maybe I carry off, if I'm lucky, I carry off the point of view that I'm going for. But as you see, if I strip away the photograph, and I do it periodically whenever I work in this technique, I periodically kind of take away the photograph, just so I can make sure that I'm capturing those details and I'm not over rendering, for one, and I'm spotting the blacks in areas to really sort of bring out the detail. What happens generally when you do spot blacks in, what it does is it acts as a framing device. It takes all that extra detail and render, and it gives it a, I say frame, it's probably the best way to do it, because if you take a piece of art and you put it within a frame, particularly if it has a black border or a white border, it allows for contrast. It allows your eye to focus on the area of detail. And I think that's why spotted black areas look so great when they're mixed with a bunch of finer lines. And that's what I was trying to capture here. So I'm focusing in, obviously, on that sort of knife-fingered glove, adding the texture. I'm trying to do my best to replicate the sort of, like, parts of it are metal and sort of rusty-looking steel. The knives themselves have their own sort of a little more, surgical, sort of, lighter steel. And then the glove itself is this kind of tattered, probably canvas, work glove that he's assembled this device onto. And I'm trying to use different line weights, as I mentioned earlier, to create the effect of sort of a rusty steel and a tattered canvas or leather glove. Here, I'm sort of moving on over to the sweater itself. He has this kind of, this red, and I think it's red and green striped sweater. And it hit me that if I render the lines in such a way, again, inconsistent, yet they're all going in the right direction. By the way, when I mentioned direction of the line, generally what happens when you taper a line, it's the thickest, the furthest away from the light source. So if you ever notice, like, sometimes you'll see art and it looks like it's glowing, or it looks like it has shadow or depth. It's because you're able to taper a line in such a way that it feathers off towards the light, and it really starts to give the appearance of volume. I've mentioned that several times in previous videos. So here I am again. I've stripped away the color photographs that were underneath. I was using kind of as an under. Actually, the photographs actually become my sort of preliminary drawing. If I were just rendering this out of my head, I would do sort of a loose underdrawing. But when I assemble those photographs and do that really, rudimentary sort of reference underlayer, I essentially, I don't need to render on top again. In other words, I don't need a mid step. I just kind of go right to rendering the line art. And that's just through experience. And then again, I mentioned previously the cross hatching. Here it is there. You're starting to see the depth that gets created by cross hatching. It's something about overlapping the lines. It's almost you add sort of a percentage more of gray. It gets a touch darker when you hatch over the line. And if you sort of study the way the patterns work, you will start to realize like which direction to render those lines in to create the maximum depth. So putting the final touches on this one, decide to add this sort of like misty sort of charcoal looking background, and then I added this sort of splatter and even some little lens flares on the knives, and then just about done here. Just a little more black to just kind of bring it in, and I took it away there at the end. But anyways, so this is Freddy Krueger, A Nightmare on Sketchy Youuu. Hope you dug it. Sketchy Youuu. Live your moment. Happy sketching, y'all. Peace.